Close your eyes and imagine standing in the ruins of Sumerian Ur, where archaeologists first uncovered what they believed were humanity's earliest cities. The ancient bricks crumble beneath your feet, but something feels wrong. These aren't the crude experiments of people learning to build civilization for the first time. These are the works of masters, perfectly planned cities that appeared fully formed in the archaeological record, complete with sophisticated drainage systems, mathematical precision, and astronomical knowledge that wouldn't be matched for millennia. Dr. Charles Leonard Woolley felt this same unease in 1922 when he first excavated these ruins. Where he expected to find the scattered remains of humanity's first fumbling attempts at city building, he instead discovered streets laid out in perfect grids, walls that ran straight and true for hundreds of yards, and foundations cut deep into bedrock with the confidence of architects who had never known failure. It was as if someone had pressed play on a civilization that was already fully designed. This was supposed to be one of mankind's first attempts at city building, but it looked like someone had been practicing for centuries. The earliest examples of human writing showed no learning curve. The first astronomical observations demonstrated accuracy that wouldn't be matched for millennia. The initial mathematical systems contained techniques that modern students struggle to master. In every domain, the pattern repeated. The Sumerians hadn't gradually developed their capabilities. They had implemented them, as if they were working from instructions rather than experimenting with possibilities. But what if the story we've been told about human civilization is incomplete? What if the Sumerians weren't humanity's first great achievement, but rather their first great reconstruction project? Tonight we're going to explore the possibility that civilization didn't begin in Sumer at all, but was rebuilt there from the fragments of something far older and more sophisticated than we've ever imagined. The mystery deepens when we consider what lies beneath these ancient foundations. In the deepest layers archaeologists can reach, they don't find the ancestors of Sumerian civilization. They find absence, not the natural emptiness of uninhabited places, but something that feels deliberately cleaned, swept, prepared. It's like walking into a house where someone has carefully removed all the family photos, leaving behind only faint outlines on the walls where frames once hung. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this emptiness. Their creation myths don't describe civilization's gradual development. They tell stories of knowledge being delivered complete and perfect by beings they called the Anunnaki. Those who came down from heaven? The word choice is telling. Not those who always were, or those who emerged from among us, but those who came down. The language suggests arrival, not origin, contact, not creation. According to these ancient texts, the Anunnaki taught humanity the arts of civilization: writing, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, agriculture, law. Every innovation that appears simultaneously in the archaeological record, as if someone had downloaded an entire cultural operating system into human consciousness. But what if these weren't myths about gods? What if they were instruction manuals disguised as stories, preserving memories of actual teachers whose origins had been deliberately forgotten? The evidence whispers of something profound. In the basement archives of the British Museum, thousands of clay tablets sit in climate-controlled silence, most never fully translated. Among them are astronomical calculations that shouldn't be possible without telescopes, mathematical techniques that anticipate discoveries made centuries later, and engineering specifications that demonstrate understanding of principles supposedly unknown to ancient civilizations. Consider the mystery of Sumerian mathematics. Their base 60 system wasn't just elegant, it was perfect for applications they hadn't yet discovered. How do you accidentally create a mathematical framework ideal for technologies that won't exist for millennia? The same system still governs how we measure time and space today. Every second ticking by on every clock in the world marks time according to instructions written by minds we can no longer identify, for purposes we no longer remember. The astronomical knowledge is even more troubling. Sumerian observers tracked Venus through its complete 584-day cycle with mathematical precision. They predicted eclipses months in advance. They understood that planets follow different paths across the sky than stars, and they developed mathematical models to predict these movements. Most disturbing of all, they described celestial phenomena that were barely visible without telescopic aid. Saturn's rings, which appeared as handles or arms in ancient texts, Jupiter's moons, described as family members accompanying the planet. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery is what lies beneath Sumer's foundations. At Eridu, the city Sumerians claimed was the first ever built. Archaeologists uncovered 17 construction layers, each built directly atop the last. These weren't random additions. Each layer followed the exact same architectural plan, the same proportions, the same orientation, the same careful attention to astronomical alignments. 17 times across centuries, builders had climbed these steps, measured these angles, and laid these foundation stones with absolute fidelity to a pattern they couldn't or wouldn't explain. It was as if they were terrified of forgetting something. But forgetting what and why was preservation so important that entire civilizations dedicated their greatest architectural achievements to maintaining instructions they may not have fully understood? The answer may lie in the flood myths that echo through every ancient culture. The Sumerian Eridu Genesis describes a time when humanity had grown too numerous and too noisy for the gods to tolerate. So the divine council decided on erasure, a flood that would wash the world clean and allow for a fresh beginning. But the god Enki disagreed. He secretly warned a man named Ziusudra, providing detailed instructions for building a vessel that could preserve life through the coming catastrophe. This isn't just mythology. Throughout Mesopotamia, excavations reveal flood layers dating to approximately 2900 BCE. Thick deposits of riverine silt mark the violent end of early urban settlements. These geological flood markers correspond exactly to cultural disruption layers, where sophisticated early civilizations suddenly disappeared and were replaced by simpler societies. The flood hadn't been global, it had been localized to the Fertile Crescent, where the world's first complex civilizations were developing. Which means the flood myths weren't describing a planetary catastrophe. They were preserving the memory of a cultural catastrophe that had felt like the end of the world to the people who experienced it. And what emerged afterward wasn't humanity's first civilization, but its first attempt at rebuilding from incomplete memories of something that had been lost. The Sumerians who rebuilt after the Great Flooding demonstrated knowledge and capabilities that seemed to exceed what should have been possible for survivors of catastrophic social collapse. Their mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and organizational systems showed sophistication that suggested continuity with advanced knowledge rather than gradual redevelopment from primitive conditions. They weren't inventing civilization, they were reconstructing it from blueprints they no longer fully understood. This pattern of loss and reconstruction may be far more common than we realize. Every ancient culture speaks of golden ages that ended in catastrophe, of gods who once walked among men before withdrawing to the heavens, of knowledge that was given and then taken away. Perhaps these aren't separate mythologies, but fragments of the same recurring story, the rise and fall of human civilizations, each one preserving what it could from the ruins of its predecessors. The silence in the archaeological record isn't evidence of absence, it's evidence of systematic forgetting, of knowledge deliberately erased or accidentally lost through the natural processes of cultural collapse. Libraries burn, languages die, institutions fall, and with them disappear the accumulated wisdom of centuries, leaving only fragments for future archaeologists to puzzle over. Today, we face the same vulnerabilities, that destroyed our predecessors. Dependence on complex systems that most people don't understand. Concentration of knowledge in institutions that could be disrupted. Reliance on technologies that require specialized expertise to maintain. If the flood came again, whether as natural disaster, social collapse, or technological failure, how much of what we consider essential knowledge would survive? The Sumerians understood this fragility. They tried to write down everything they considered important. They created redundant copies. They distributed their libraries across multiple cities. They embedded crucial information in myths and rituals that could survive even if the written records were lost. They understood that civilization was always one library fire away from amnesia. But perhaps their greatest insight was recognizing that preservation required more than just recording information. It required embedding knowledge so deeply in the foundations of civilization itself that even when everything else collapsed, the essential patterns would survive. The mathematics that still governs our clocks, the astronomical alignments that still guide our architecture, the stories that still echo through our myths. The darkness beneath Mesopotamia holds more than artifacts and tablets. It holds the memory of humanity's first conscious effort to preserve knowledge against the inevitable forces of forgetting. The Sumerians weren't just building cities, they were building insurance policies against the collapse of memory itself. And in that darkness, something is still waiting to be remembered. Something that knows we've been here before, something that's watching us forget the same lessons, make the same mistakes, lose the same knowledge that took millennia to accumulate. The question isn't whether human civilization began in Sumer. The question is, what are we forgetting while we congratulate ourselves on what we think we've discovered? Because if the Sumerians were rebuilding from fragments of something greater that had been lost, then perhaps we are too. Perhaps every generation is engaged in the same desperate effort to preserve and transmit knowledge across the gap between what we remember and what we've forgotten. And perhaps the real mystery isn't what happened in ancient Mesopotamia, but what's happening right now, in our own time, as we struggle to maintain the continuity of human understanding against the eternal forces of erasure and time. The darkness beneath Mesopotamia whispers a warning. Civilizations rise and fall, knowledge is gained and lost, and the price of forgetting is always higher than the cost of remembering. The question is whether we're wise enough to listen while there's still time to learn. The obsession with preservation runs deeper than ancient kings seeking immortality. It pulses through every ziggurat built to withstand millennia, every tablet pressed with care into clay, every myth told and retold until the original speakers were forgotten. The Sumerians didn't just document their daily lives. They created a civilization-wide backup system, as if they understood something we've forgotten about: the fragility of human knowledge. But what exactly were they trying so desperately to preserve? And why does their urgency feel less like ancient paranoia and more like prophetic warning? The answer might lie not in what they remembered, but in what they were trying to prevent us from forgetting again. Think about how information disappears in our own time, not through dramatic book burnings or catastrophic floods, but through the quiet entropy of neglect. Files become corrupted, servers crash, languages evolve until old texts become unreadable, institutions change priorities, and suddenly entire fields of knowledge become unfunded, unstudied, irrelevant. The Sumerians seem to have understood this process intimately. Their response wasn't to create a single great library that could burn in one night. Instead, they distributed their knowledge across multiple formats, multiple locations, multiple modes of transmission. They wrote it in clay. They carved it in stone. They embedded it in religious rituals that people would repeat without understanding. They encoded it in myths that would survive even if the technical manuals were lost. This wasn't the work of a primitive civilization learning to write. This was the work of a culture that had already experienced profound loss. Consider the peculiar nature of Sumerian creation myths. Most cultures describe creation as something that happened once, in the beginning, but Sumerian texts consistently describe creation as restoration. The world wasn't made from nothing. It was rebuilt from chaos. Order wasn't established, it was re-established. The gods didn't invent civilization, they recovered it. Even the word they used for their most important cultural achievements, the ME, carries this sense of recovery rather than innovation. The ME weren't created by humans or even by gods. They were retrieved from the cosmic waters, restored to their proper place, redistributed to cities that would maintain them properly. It's the language of people who have seen knowledge lost before and are determined not to let it happen again. But the most unsettling aspect of Sumerian preservation efforts isn't their scale or sophistication, it's their selectivity. They didn't try to preserve everything, they chose specific knowledge, specific stories, specific technical procedures, as if they were working from a priority list, saving the most essential information first, the knowledge that would be hardest to rediscover if it disappeared. What criteria guided these choices? What made something worth preserving across millennia, while other knowledge was allowed to fade? The answer might be found in the patterns of what survived. Mathematical relationships that govern astronomical observation, engineering principles that enable monumental construction, agricultural techniques that support large populations, legal frameworks that maintain social order, medical knowledge that addresses disease and injury. In other words, the foundational knowledge necessary to rebuild civilization from scratch. Not the luxuries of an advanced culture, but the essentials of human survival at a complex social level, the knowledge that would matter most if everything else was lost and humanity had to start over. This suggests that the Sumerians weren't just preserving their own achievements, they were creating a civilizational recovery manual, a guide for rebuilding human society after catastrophic collapse, and they seem to have expected that collapse to happen again. The flood myths take on new meaning in this context. They're not just stories about divine punishment or natural disasters, they're instructions about civilizational cycles, warnings about the patterns that lead to collapse, and guidance for those who would need to rebuild afterward. The righteous survivor who receives divine warning isn't just a moral exemplar, he's a knowledge keeper, selected not for his virtue, but for his ability to preserve essential information through the transition. His ark isn't just a refuge for biological diversity, it's a mobile library, a preservation system designed to maintain critical knowledge through the chaos of civilizational collapse. The post-flood world isn't just a fresh start, it's a restoration project, guided by fragments of pre-flood knowledge that survived the catastrophe. This interpretation transforms how we understand the relationship between myth and history. These stories aren't primitive explanations for natural phenomena. They're sophisticated instructions for civilizational continuity, encoded in narrative form to ensure their survival through periods when technical manuals might be lost or forgotten. The gods who teach humanity after the flood aren't supernatural beings. They're the knowledge keepers themselves, the survivors who maintained essential information through the collapse and are now working to restore what was lost. But restoration is always incomplete. Each cycle loses something. Knowledge that was once clear becomes ambiguous. Techniques that were once precise become approximations. Understanding that was once systematic becomes fragmentary. The Sumerians seem to have been acutely aware of this degradation. Their obsession with creating multiple copies, their insistence on exact replication, their embedding of knowledge in ritual and myth, all suggest a culture fighting against the entropy that erodes information over time. They were trying to slow the decay, to preserve as much as possible for as long as possible, knowing that eventually even their efforts would fail and the cycle would begin again. This creates a haunting possibility. What if human civilization isn't a linear progression from simple to complex, but a cyclical process of collapse and recovery? What if the Sumerians represented not the beginning of civilization, but its first successful restoration after an earlier collapse so complete that almost nothing survived? The evidence fits this interpretation uncomfortably well. The sudden appearance of sophisticated knowledge, the lack of developmental stages, the emphasis on preservation over innovation, the myths that describe recovery rather than creation. All of it suggests a culture that had inherited fragments of something greater and was working desperately to maintain what they could, while slowly losing the ability to fully understand what they were preserving. If this is true, then modern civilization might be living through its own version of the same process. We've achieved remarkable technological sophistication, but how much of it depends on knowledge that only a few people truly understand? How much would survive if our current institutions collapsed? The Sumerians' answer was to create preservation systems that could outlast any single civilization. They distributed knowledge across multiple formats, embedded it in stories that would be retold even when their meaning was forgotten, and built it into monuments that would endure long after the cultures that created them had disappeared. We've taken a different approach. We've concentrated our knowledge in digital systems that require constant maintenance, complex infrastructure, and specialized expertise. Our preservation strategy depends on the continuous functioning of institutions that have existed for decades, not millennia. The Sumerians might have considered this approach dangerously fragile. Their civilization lasted for over 2,000 years. Ours has existed for less than 3 centuries in its current form. They planned for preservation across multiple civilizational cycles. We struggle to maintain knowledge across single generations. Perhaps the real lesson from Sumerian preservation efforts isn't about the past, but about the future. Not about what they were trying to save, but about what we might be losing, while we congratulate ourselves on our unprecedented access to information. Because access isn't the same as preservation, and preservation isn't the same as understanding. The Sumerians understood something we've forgotten, that knowledge is fragile, that civilizations end, that the most important information isn't always the most obvious, and that the true test of any culture isn't how much it can discover, but how much it can preserve for those who will need to rebuild when the current system fails. The clay tablets scattered across museums worldwide aren't just artifacts from the past. They're messages from a civilization that succeeded in preserving essential knowledge across the collapse that ended their world. The question isn't whether they were right to be so concerned about preservation. The question is whether we're making the same preparations for our own inevitable ending, and whether future archaeologists will find anything worth preserving in the ruins of our digital age. The digital glow of the archive's computer screen cast long shadows across Dr. Sarah Chen's face as she scrolled through yet another database of untranslated Sumerian tablets. It was 3:47 a.m. and she'd been at this for hours, but something about the night shift in the Yale Library's basement felt appropriate for the work she was doing. Down here, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of millennia, she was trying to solve a puzzle that had been nagging at her for months. The tablet on her screen, catalogued as YBC 7289, contained what appeared to be a standard mathematical exercise. But as Chen studied the cuneiform symbols more carefully, she began to notice something that made her lean forward in her chair. The calculations weren't just demonstrating mathematical principles, they were demonstrating principles that shouldn't have existed for another 1,000 years. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered such anomalies. Over the past year, working through the backlog of untranslated tablets in various museum collections, Chen had begun to notice a pattern that troubled her. The more she studied these ancient texts, the more convinced she became that something fundamental about our understanding of Sumerian civilization was wrong. The accepted narrative was clean and logical. Around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians developed the world's first writing system, created the earliest known cities, and laid the foundations for what we call civilization. They were innovators, pioneers who gradually developed their capabilities through trial and error, learning from their mistakes and slowly building the complex society that would influence all subsequent civilizations. But that narrative assumed that innovation happened linearly, that knowledge accumulated gradually, that each generation built upon the discoveries of the previous one. What Chen was seeing in these tablets suggested something entirely different. The Sumerians hadn't developed their sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and engineering through gradual experimentation. They had implemented these systems as if they were following instructions. The mathematical precision was what first caught her attention. Sumerian tablets contained calculations that demonstrated understanding of geometric principles, algebraic relationships, and even early forms of calculus. These weren't the fumbling attempts of a civilization learning to count. These were the refined techniques of minds that already understood abstract mathematical concepts. The astronomical knowledge was even more puzzling. Sumerian astronomers had tracked planetary movements with accuracy that wouldn't be matched for millennia. They understood that Venus appeared as both morning and evening star, recognized the complex cycles of lunar eclipses, and calculated celestial events with mathematical precision that seemed to require instruments they supposedly didn't possess. But perhaps most intriguing were the texts that described the origin of this knowledge. Sumerian creation myths consistently portrayed civilization not as human invention, but as divine instruction. The Anunnaki, those mysterious beings who came down from heaven, were described as teachers who provided ready-made knowledge systems to humanity. The MI, those cosmic principles that governed civilization, weren't discovered through human experimentation, but recovered from some earlier source. Chen had initially dismissed these mythological accounts as symbolic explanations for cultural innovation. But as she worked through more tablets, she began to wonder if the Sumerians were describing something more literal. What if these myths preserved cultural memory of actual instruction, not from gods, but from teachers whose identity had been lost to time? The preservation techniques suggested this possibility. Sumerian scribes hadn't just recorded information, they had embedded it in multiple formats designed to survive cultural disruption. Technical knowledge was encoded in mythological narratives that could be transmitted orally, even if the writing system was lost. Mathematical principles were built into architectural monuments that would endure even if the texts were destroyed. Astronomical observations were preserved in calendar systems that would continue functioning even if their theoretical foundations were forgotten. This wasn't the behavior of a civilization developing new knowledge. This was the behavior of a civilization desperately trying to preserve existing knowledge against the possibility of loss. The implications were staggering. If the Sumerians had inherited their sophisticated capabilities rather than developing them, then the entire timeline of human civilization needed to be reconsidered. The sudden appearance of complex urban societies, advanced mathematics, and precise astronomy wasn't the result of remarkable human innovation. It was the result of systematic preservation of knowledge that had been developed elsewhere, earlier, by minds whose identity had been deliberately or accidentally erased from the historical record. Chen pushed back from her desk and walked to the small window that looked out onto the Yale campus. Above, the stars that Sumerian astronomers had mapped with such precision still followed their ancient patterns, indifferent to human attempts to understand their significance. But those ancient observers had known something about the cosmos that modern civilization was still struggling to rediscover. The silence in the archive felt different now, pregnant with the weight of questions that challenged everything she thought she knew about human development. If one ancient civilization had achieved remarkable sophistication and then disappeared so completely that only fragments of knowledge survived in later reconstructions, how many others might have followed the same pattern? The thought that had been growing in her mind for months now crystallized into something approaching certainty. Modern civilization might not represent the pinnacle of human achievement, but simply the latest attempt to recover capabilities that had been lost and regained multiple times throughout history. The Sumerians weren't humanity's first complex society. They were humanity's first successful attempt at reconstruction. And if that was true, then the most important question wasn't how the Sumerians had achieved so much so quickly, but what knowledge modern civilization might be losing while congratulating itself on its unprecedented sophistication. Because if the pattern held, if human societies inevitably forgot more than they remembered, then the real mystery wasn't what the ancients had known, but what we were failing to preserve for those who would come after us. Chen returned to her computer and opened a new document. She had a paper to write, one that would challenge fundamental assumptions about the development of human knowledge. But as she began to type, she found herself thinking not about the past but about the future. Somewhere in the digital archives and institutional memories of contemporary civilization, crucial knowledge was being quietly lost, filtered out by the same forces that had erased the identity of the Sumerians' teachers. The cycle was continuing, and she was watching it happen in real time. The only question was whether anyone would notice before it was too late, as we've explored the mysteries of ancient civilizations and their sudden appearance in history. One question continues to echo through the archaeological record. What if these weren't beginnings at all, but endings? What if humanity's story isn't one of gradual ascent from primitive origins, but rather a cycle of rise, fall, and desperate reconstruction? The evidence we've examined suggests something far more unsettling than simple historical gaps. The Sumerians didn't slowly develop their sophisticated knowledge systems. They implemented them as if following instructions preserved from an earlier time. Their myths speak not of invention, but of recovery. Not of creation, but of remembering. The word they used for their own achievements, MI, didn't mean divine laws or cosmic principles in the way we understand them. It meant something closer to backup files or restoration protocols. Consider the pattern that emerges when we look beyond individual mysteries. Göbekli Tepe, built by hunter-gatherers who supposedly lacked the organizational capacity for such projects, was carefully buried as if its builders knew their time was ending. The megalithic structures scattered across the globe demonstrate engineering precision that seems to exceed the technological capabilities of their attributed time periods. The flood myths that appear in every culture on Earth don't describe random natural disasters, but systematic resets that preserve just enough knowledge to begin again. This suggests that the fragility of human civilization isn't a modern concern born of nuclear weapons or climate change. It's an ancient reality that our predecessors understood far better than we do. They built their knowledge systems not for expansion, but for survival. Not to reach new heights, but to prevent catastrophic forgetting. The astronomical knowledge preserved in Sumerian tablets, the mathematical systems we still use today, the engineering principles embedded in monuments designed to outlast empires, all point to the same conclusion. Someone had learned the hard way that civilizations don't just rise and fall, they can disappear so completely that their successors have no memory of what came before. What makes this particularly relevant to our current moment is how vulnerable our own knowledge systems have become. We've created the most sophisticated information storage and retrieval systems in human history, yet we've also created the most fragile ones. Digital archives can be corrupted or deleted. Specialized knowledge exists only in the minds of experts who retire and die. Critical infrastructure depends on supply chains that can be disrupted by events as simple as a traffic jam in a canal. The ancients understood something we've forgotten. Knowledge isn't automatically preserved. It survives only through deliberate, redundant, and often heroic efforts to maintain it across generational transitions. They encoded essential information in stories that would be memorable even to illiterate populations. They built astronomical alignments into stone monuments that would function as calendars even if the mathematical knowledge behind them was lost. They created backup systems for their backup systems, but perhaps most importantly, they understood that the greatest threat to human knowledge isn't external catastrophe, but internal forgetting. Civilizations don't usually end with dramatic collapses. They end with gradual erosion of understanding, slow loss of institutional memory, and the quiet abandonment of knowledge that no longer seems immediately useful. Modern archaeology reveals this pattern everywhere. The sophisticated Roman concrete that built structures lasting millennia was forgotten during the Dark Ages. The precise astronomical knowledge of the Maya was abandoned when their cities were deserted. The engineering principles behind megalithic construction were lost so completely that we're still trying to reverse engineer them from the monuments themselves. This isn't ancient history, it's ongoing reality. How many people today could rebuild our technological civilization from scratch if the existing infrastructure disappeared? How many understand the principles behind the systems they use daily? How much of our essential knowledge exists only in digital form, vulnerable to the same kinds of catastrophic loss that erased previous civilizations? The Sumerians seem to have been acutely aware of this vulnerability. Their obsessive repetition of architectural patterns, their embedding of technical knowledge in religious rituals, their creation of multiple redundant copies of important texts, all suggest a culture that had learned from previous failures. They weren't just building a civilization, they were building a civilization that could survive its own collapse. Perhaps this is why their achievements seem so mysteriously advanced, not because they possessed superior technology, but because they possessed superior wisdom about the fragility of human knowledge. They understood that the most sophisticated system is worthless if it can't be maintained across generations. They designed their civilization not for efficiency or growth, but for persistence. This perspective transforms our understanding of what we call lost civilizations. They weren't lost in the sense of being hidden or forgotten. They were lost in the sense of being systematically erased by the same forces that threaten every human society. The tendency to prioritize immediate needs over long-term preservation. The assumption that what we know today will automatically be known tomorrow. The failure to recognize that knowledge is not a possession, but a responsibility. The silence in the archaeological record isn't just the absence of evidence, it's the presence of forgetting. And forgetting, as the ancients understood, is not a passive process, it's an active one that requires constant vigilance to prevent. So when we look at the mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, the precision of ancient astronomy, the sophistication of Sumerian mathematics, we're not seeing evidence of lost golden ages or ancient alien visitors. We're seeing evidence of human societies that understood something we're still learning, that the greatest achievement of any civilization is not what it builds, but what it preserves, not what it creates, but what it remembers. The real mystery isn't how ancient civilizations achieved such remarkable sophistication, it's how they knew that sophistication alone wasn't enough. They knew that without deliberate, systematic preservation, even the most advanced knowledge would vanish as if it had never existed. They built their civilizations not just to flourish, but to be remembered. And in our own age of unprecedented technological capability and unprecedented fragility, perhaps their most important lesson is this: The measure of a civilization's success isn't how high it rises, but how much of its essential knowledge survives its inevitable transformation. The ancients understood that we're not just building for ourselves, we're building for the survivors who will have to reconstruct human civilization from whatever fragments we leave behind. The question isn't whether our civilization will end. The question is what we're preserving for those who will have to begin again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins of Harappa as Dr. Sarah Chen stood before the ancient wells, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she thought she knew about the development of human civilization. The Indus Valley cities had possessed sophisticated urban planning, advanced drainage systems, and standardized weights and measures that wouldn't be matched for millennia. Yet according to conventional chronology, these achievements had emerged from virtually nothing, fully formed around 2600 BCE, as if someone had activated a complex civilization overnight. Chen had spent the better part of 2 decades studying ancient urban development patterns, and something fundamental wasn't adding up. Cities were supposed to grow organically, leaving archaeological traces of their gradual development. But here, beneath the Pakistani soil, lay evidence of planning and engineering that seemed to skip the learning curve entirely. The precision was unsettling, the sophistication inexplicable, and the silence that followed their abandonment around 1900 BCE was complete. She walked through the excavated streets, noting the mathematical precision of the grid layout, the advanced understanding of hydraulic engineering evident in the drainage systems, and the standardized brick sizes that spoke of industrial-level coordination. These weren't the rough experiments of a civilization learning to build cities. These were the products of minds that already understood urban planning at a level that wouldn't be rediscovered until the modern era. The absence of developmental layers troubled her most. Every other ancient city showed archaeological evidence of growth, of trial and error, of gradually increasing sophistication. But Harappa and its sister cities appeared to have emerged fully realized, as if their builders had been working from blueprints rather than inventing solutions as they went. In the quiet heat of the afternoon, Chen found herself thinking about the broader implications of what she was seeing. If the Indus Valley civilization represented not innovation, but reconstruction, then the entire timeline of human development needed to be reconsidered. Because somewhere, buried deeper than archaeologists had yet dared to dig, might lie the original plans for organized society, waiting like a memory that humanity had been trying to recover for thousands of years. The artifacts told the same story. The famous Harappan seals with their undeciphered script showed artistic and symbolic sophistication that suggested long-established cultural traditions. The bronze figurines displayed technical mastery that implied centuries of metallurgical knowledge. The standardized weights and measures revealed administrative systems complex enough to coordinate trade across vast distances. Yet none of this knowledge seemed to have developed gradually. It appeared simultaneously across multiple cities, as if the entire civilization had been activated according to a master plan that had been preserved from some earlier time. The consistency was what made it extraordinary, the sense that every settlement had been built according to the same underlying principles, following the same engineering standards, implementing the same organizational systems. Chen examined a section of the ancient drainage system, marveling at the engineering precision that had created a network of covered sewers, public wells, and waste management facilities that surpassed anything that would exist again for over a millennium. The knowledge embedded in these systems wasn't primitive or experimental. It was sophisticated, practical, and effective. It worked, but worked for whom? And why had it been abandoned so completely that even the script remained unreadable? The silence that followed the Indus Valley civilization's collapse was as mysterious as its sudden appearance. No gradual decline, No evidence of conquest or natural disaster, just abandonment so complete that later civilizations in the region showed no memory of what had come before. Standing in the ruins of what had once been humanity's most advanced urban civilization, Chen felt the weight of questions that archaeology wasn't equipped to answer. The Indus Valley cities weren't just ancient, they were anomalous, representing a level of planning and coordination that seemed to exceed what should have been possible for their time period. Perhaps the most unsettling realization was that if one advanced civilization could appear fully formed and then vanish so completely that only ruins remained, how many others might have followed the same pattern? How much of human history might be missing from the archaeological record, not because it had never existed, but because it had been systematically erased by the same forces that had silenced the Indus Valley? As the sun began to set over the excavation site, Chen walked back through the ancient streets, past the public baths and administrative buildings, past the warehouses and residential districts that had once housed a population larger than many modern cities. The precision of the planning was still evident in every carefully laid brick, every perfectly aligned drain, every mathematically proportioned courtyard. The Indus Valley civilization had possessed knowledge that later cultures would struggle to rediscover. They had built cities that functioned more efficiently than settlements that wouldn't exist for centuries. They had developed systems of organization and administration that implied institutional memory spanning generations. And then they had vanished, leaving behind only the physical evidence of their remarkable achievements and the haunting question of where such knowledge had originated. In the growing darkness, Chen could almost hear the silence that had fallen over these ruins 3.5 millennia ago. It was the same silence that seemed to surround all of humanity's greatest ancient achievements, the quiet that suggested that much of what we called progress might actually be recovery, attempts to rebuild capabilities that had been lost when earlier civilizations had faced their own moments of forgetting. The Indus Valley cities stood as monuments to human potential, evidence that organized society could achieve remarkable things when guided by comprehensive understanding and systematic planning. But they also stood as warnings about the fragility of civilization itself, reminders that even the most sophisticated achievements could be lost if the knowledge that created them wasn't successfully transmitted to future generations. And perhaps that was the real lesson of Harappa and its sister cities. Not just that ancient civilizations could achieve remarkable things, but that achievement without preservation was temporary, that knowledge without transmission was vulnerable, and that the greatest threat to human progress might not be external catastrophe, but internal forgetting. The silence that had claimed the Indus Valley wasn't just historical accident, it was a preview of what could happen to any civilization that failed to maintain the systems necessary to preserve its own understanding. Chen locked her field notes in the site office and walked back toward the modern road, leaving behind the ruins of a civilization that had possessed answers to questions contemporary society was still learning to ask. Tomorrow she would return to continue the careful work of excavation and analysis, adding another small piece to the puzzle of human history. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of the Pakistani countryside, she carried with her the unsettling knowledge that some puzzles might never be complete, that some silences might never be broken, and that the greatest mysteries of human achievement might not be how ancient civilizations accomplished so much, but why they allowed so much to be forgotten. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen sat surrounded by thousands of clay tablets in the Yale archive, each one a fragment of something vast that had been systematically erased from human memory. Outside, the modern world rushed past in its confident assumption that progress was linear, that knowledge accumulated rather than disappeared, that civilization was a ladder. Humanity climbed rather than a cycle it entered repeatedly. But the tablets whispered otherwise. They spoke of knowledge that appeared fully formed, of systems so sophisticated they still governed how we measure time and space, of stories that might not be mythology at all, but instruction manuals written by minds that understood something we had forgotten. The forgetting that shapes human history. What if the greatest threat to human knowledge isn't catastrophic destruction, but something far more insidious? What if forgetting isn't an accident, but a process, systematic and ongoing, that operates not through dramatic collapse, but through the quiet bureaucratic decision to file certain questions under not worth pursuing and leave them there, gathering dust in the archives of institutional indifference? Consider how knowledge actually survives, not automatically, not through some natural law of preservation, but through deliberate human choice. Someone must decide what deserves to be copied, what merits funding, what questions are worth asking. Someone must choose which texts to translate, which sites to excavate, which theories to support. And in those choices, entire chapters of human understanding can vanish as quietly as morning mist. The Sumerians understood this. They created redundant copies of their most important texts. They distributed libraries across multiple cities. They embedded crucial information in myths and rituals that could survive even if the written records were lost. They understood that civilization was always one library fire away from amnesia. They were trying to create a distributed backup system for human knowledge itself, but their backup system failed, mostly. The libraries burned, the languages died, the institutions that maintained their knowledge collapsed. What survived did so by accident, preserved not by human intention, but by the fortunate catastrophe of fire that baked clay tablets instead of destroying them, by the protective burial of sand and time, by the random chance that placed certain artifacts beyond the reach of conquest and conversion. And what we recovered from that accidental preservation challenges everything we thought we knew about the development of human capability. Advanced mathematics that appeared without development, astronomical knowledge that exceeded the tools available to acquire it, engineering specifications that demonstrated understanding of principles supposedly unknown to ancient civilizations, urban planning that suggested builders who understood complex systems from the moment construction began. These discoveries don't fit comfortable narratives about gradual progress. They suggest instead that human knowledge follows patterns of loss and recovery, that civilizations rise and fall in cycles, that what we call innovation might often be reconstruction. The Sumerians didn't invent civilization, they rebuilt it from fragments of something that had been lost. But here's what makes this pattern truly unsettling. It's still happening. The same forces that erased ancient knowledge are operating today, not through fire and conquest, but through the systematic filtering of information through institutional frameworks that determine what deserves attention and what can be safely ignored. Academic careers depend on asking questions that align with established paradigms. Research funding flows toward projects that promise to clarify accepted theories rather than challenge them. Publication opportunities exist for work that builds incrementally on recognized knowledge rather than suggests that knowledge might be fundamentally incomplete. The result is a kind of intellectual ecosystem that selects against disruptive discoveries, ensuring that only information compatible with existing frameworks receives the resources necessary for development and dissemination. Anomalous artifacts sit in museum storage, catalogued but unstudied. Unusual texts remain untranslated because they don't fit comfortable interpretations. Patterns remain invisible because investigating them requires interdisciplinary approaches that don't align with departmental structures. We are living through our own age of systematic forgetting, losing understanding not through catastrophe, but through the simple, administrative decision to look in some directions and not others, to ask some questions and not others, to preserve some possibilities and quietly abandon others. The silence isn't the absence of evidence, it's the presence of choice. And perhaps that's the most important lesson the Sumerians left us, encoded not in their tablets, but in their understanding of how fragile human memory so really is. Knowledge doesn't survive automatically. It survives because people make deliberate choices to maintain it across generations, to copy it when it begins to fade, to protect it when it comes under threat, to remember it when forgetting would be easier. The tablets speak of teachers who came down from heaven to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost. But what if those teachers were simply human beings who understood something we're still learning? That memory requires intention. That preservation demands effort. That the most profound threat to human knowledge isn't the dramatic collapse of civilizations, but the quiet erosion of curiosity itself. Standing in archives around the world, surrounded by fragments of human understanding that survived against impossible odds, we face the same choice the Sumerians faced. What knowledge do we consider important enough to preserve? What questions do we think future generations will need answered? What understanding are we willing to protect against the forgetting that comes not through fire and flood, but through the simple human tendency to assume that what we have can never be lost? The tablets wait in their climate-controlled silence, holding fragments of wisdom that someone considered important enough to encode in permanent form. They remind us that we are not the first civilization to face the challenge of preserving knowledge across time, and we probably won't be the last. The question is whether we'll learn from their example or repeat their mistakes, whether we'll choose to remember or allow ourselves to forget, whether we'll build systems robust enough to survive the cycles of rise and fall that seem to characterize human civilization. Because in the end, the greatest mystery isn't what the ancients knew that we've forgotten. It's what we know today that we're already in the process of forgetting. And why does that realization feel less like discovery and more like recognition of something we've always suspected but never dared to acknowledge about the true fragility of human understanding? As the sun sets over our modern digital age, with its servers humming and screens glowing, we find ourselves at a peculiar crossroads. We live in an era where information is supposed to be immortal, where every tweet, every video, every digital fragment can theoretically exist forever. Yet here we are, potentially facing the same fragility that haunted our ancestors. The patterns we've explored throughout this series reveal something profound about human nature. We are creatures of cycles, not linear progression. Knowledge accumulates, reaches peaks of sophistication, then gradually erodes through the simple passage of time and the quiet indifference of institutions. The Sumerians understood this. They built their knowledge into stone and myth, into ritual and repetition, because they knew that civilization itself was fragile. Today, we face our own version of this ancient challenge. Our libraries are digital, our knowledge encoded in formats that may become unreadable in decades. Our institutions, like those ancient temple schools, make decisions about what deserves preservation and what can be safely forgotten. The difference is that we've convinced ourselves we're immune to the forgetting that claimed our predecessors. But are we really? Consider how much knowledge already disappears in our time. Academic papers locked behind paywalls that few can access. Research buried in databases that require specialized training to navigate. Discoveries that challenge established paradigms quietly filtered out of funding priorities. The same institutional pressures that shaped what survived from ancient libraries operate today, just with different mechanisms. The flood isn't always made of water. Sometimes it's made of information overload, where crucial insights drown in an ocean of data. Sometimes it's made of technological obsolescence, where entire archives become unreadable when systems evolve. Sometimes it's made of simple human choice, where each generation decides what's worth maintaining and what can be allowed to fade. We've seen how the Sumerians encoded their most important knowledge in multiple forms, mathematical principles in both tablets and temple architecture, astronomical observations in both written records and stone alignments, stories that preserved technical information in memorable narrative frameworks. They understood that survival required redundancy, that crucial knowledge needed to exist in forms that could outlast any single preservation system. What are we encoding in stone today? What knowledge do we consider so essential that we're building it into structures designed to outlast our current institutions? The answer might surprise you. Some of our most important insights exist only in formats that are already becoming obsolete, stored in systems that assume eternal maintenance by organizations that may not exist in a generation. The myths we've explored weren't just ancient entertainment. They were instruction manuals disguised as stories, technical knowledge wrapped in narrative frameworks that could survive the collapse of the cultures that created them. When the libraries burned, the stories remained. When the institutions fell, the myths endured. When the written knowledge was lost, the oral traditions carried forward whatever fragments they could preserve. Perhaps this is why these ancient stories feel so familiar, so urgent. They're not just describing what happened to previous civilizations. They're describing what happens to all civilizations, including ours. The cycle of knowledge gained and lost, preserved and forgotten, discovered and rediscovered. The eternal human struggle against entropy, against the tendency of complex systems to decay into simpler states. The real mystery isn't whether ancient civilizations possess knowledge we've lost. The real mystery is whether we possess the wisdom to preserve what we've gained for those who come after us. Because in the end, every civilization becomes ancient. Every advanced society eventually faces the choice between preservation and progress, between maintaining what exists and creating what comes next. The silence in those ancient archives isn't empty. It's full of lessons we're still learning to hear. Lessons about the fragility of knowledge, the importance of redundancy, the necessity of encoding crucial information in forms that can survive disruption. Lessons about the responsibility each generation bears to the next, to pass forward not just data, but understanding. As we stand at our own crossroads, surrounded by more information than any previous civilization has ever possessed, we might ask ourselves the same questions that haunt ancient librarians. What deserves to survive? What knowledge is so essential that it must be preserved at all costs? What stories are we telling that future archaeologists might discover in our ruins? The answer might be simpler than we think. Perhaps the most important knowledge we can preserve isn't technical or scientific, but something more fundamental. The understanding that knowledge itself is precious, that wisdom is fragile, that each generation must choose what to remember and what to forget. The recognition that we are not the first to face these choices, and we will not be the last. In the quiet spaces between what we know and what we've forgotten, between what we've discovered and what we've lost, lies the eternal human story. It's a story of minds reaching toward understanding, of hands building monuments to memory, of voices speaking across the centuries to whoever might be listening. The ancient scribes pressed their knowledge into clay, hoping it would survive. We encode ours in silicon and light, hoping for the same immortality, but perhaps the real preservation happens in the telling, in the moment when one mind shares understanding with another, when knowledge passes from teacher to student, from generation to generation, carrying forward the flame of human curiosity. The mysteries we've explored aren't just about the past, they're about the future we're creating, the knowledge we're preserving, the stories we're telling. They're about the choice we make every day between remembering and forgetting, between preservation and progress, between the wisdom of our ancestors and the possibilities of tomorrow. And in that choice, in that eternal human struggle against the silence that waits, at the end of all things, we find not just the secret of ancient civilizations, but the secret of our own survival. Because in the end, we are all custodians of memory, all guardians of knowledge, all voices speaking into the darkness, hoping someone will remember what we've learned and build upon what we've discovered. As we reach the end of this exploration into the forgotten chapters of human history, we find ourselves confronting a profound realization. The evidence we've examined doesn't just challenge our understanding of when civilization began, but fundamentally questions how we define progress itself. If the sophisticated knowledge displayed by ancient cultures like Sumer, the Indus Valley, and the builders of Göbekli Tepe represents reconstruction rather than innovation, then we must reconsider our entire narrative of human development. The implications extend far beyond academic curiosity. When we look at the precision of ancient astronomical alignments, the mathematical sophistication embedded in temple architecture, and the complex urban planning of supposedly primitive societies, we're witnessing something remarkable. These aren't the fumbling first attempts of emerging civilizations, but the careful reconstruction efforts of peoples who understood they were working with fragments of something far greater. Consider the weight of this possibility. Somewhere in our distant past, there may have existed civilizations that achieved levels of understanding we're only beginning to approach today. They developed methods of preserving knowledge that transcended the fragility of individual lifespans and even entire cultures. They encoded their most essential discoveries into myths, monuments, and mathematical principles that could survive catastrophic collapse and guide future generations back toward enlightenment. This pattern of preservation and reconstruction suggests a profound truth about human nature. We are not just builders of civilization, but guardians of knowledge. Throughout history, there have always been those who recognized the fragility of human achievement and took deliberate steps to ensure its survival. They understood that civilizations rise and fall like tides, but that within each cycle lies the potential for renewal and rediscovery. The mythological traditions we've explored reveal this understanding in their deepest structures. When flood myths appear across disconnected cultures, they're not just recording natural disasters, but preserving instructions for cultural survival. When creation stories describe the emergence of order from chaos, they're teaching future generations how to rebuild when everything seems lost. These narratives serve as cultural DNA, carrying the essential information needed to reconstruct civilization from its scattered remains. But perhaps the most striking aspect of this ancient preservation strategy is its recognition of human nature's tendency toward forgetting. The builders of these systems understood that knowledge doesn't simply vanish through external catastrophe. More often, it dies through neglect, through the gradual erosion of institutional memory, through the simple human tendency to take inherited wisdom for granted. This understanding becomes particularly urgent when we examine our own moment in history. We live in an age of unprecedented access to information, yet also unprecedented fragility in how that information is stored and transmitted. Our digital archives, our institutional knowledge, our cultural memories all depend on systems that could fail in ways our ancestors couldn't have imagined. The parallels are unsettling. Just as ancient civilizations may have lost vast repositories of knowledge through institutional collapse, we face the possibility of losing centuries of accumulated understanding through digital decay, institutional failure, or simple neglect. The difference is that our potential losses could be even more catastrophic in scope, yet the ancient preservation strategies offer hope and guidance. The principle of redundancy that scattered similar knowledge across multiple cultures and continents remains relevant today. The practice of embedding essential information in multiple formats, from practical applications to mythological narratives, provides a model for modern preservation efforts. The understanding that knowledge must be actively maintained and transmitted, not simply stored, speaks directly to our contemporary challenges. When we look at the evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe, we're not just seeing impressive ancient architecture, we're witnessing the end result of a preservation strategy that successfully transmitted complex knowledge across millennia. The astronomical alignments, the mathematical principles, the construction techniques all represent information that survived multiple cycles of civilizational collapse and renewal. This perspective transforms our understanding of archaeological mysteries. The seemingly impossible precision of ancient monuments becomes evidence of successful knowledge preservation. The mathematical sophistication of early civilizations reveals itself as the fruit of long-term cultural memory projects. The global distribution of similar technologies and concepts suggests not independent invention, but the successful implementation of redundant preservation strategies. But we must also acknowledge the darker implications of this evidence. If advanced civilizations have indeed risen and fallen multiple times throughout human history, then our current achievements may be far more fragile than we imagine. The knowledge we take for granted, the technologies we depend upon, the cultural wisdom we've inherited could all be lost if we fail to actively preserve and transmit them. The ancient understanding of cyclical time, present in so many mythological traditions, may reflect a hard-won wisdom about the nature of human civilization. Progress isn't necessarily linear. Knowledge can be lost as easily as it's gained. Each generation must actively choose to preserve and build upon what came before, or risk seeing it vanish into the fog of forgotten history. This cyclical perspective doesn't diminish human achievement, but rather emphasizes its preciousness. Every advance in understanding, every technological breakthrough, every cultural innovation represents a victory against the natural tendency toward entropy and forgetting. The fact that knowledge can be preserved across multiple civilizational cycles makes each successful transmission a testament to human ingenuity and determination. The evidence we've explored suggests that our ancestors understood this responsibility deeply. They didn't simply create impressive monuments or develop sophisticated technologies. They designed systems specifically intended to preserve essential knowledge through periods of collapse and darkness. They embedded their most important discoveries in forms that could survive when everything else failed. In our contemporary context, this ancient wisdom becomes particularly relevant. We face challenges that could threaten the continuity of human knowledge in ways both familiar and unprecedented. Climate change, political instability, technological dependence, and cultural fragmentation all pose risks to the preservation of accumulated understanding. Yet we also possess tools and opportunities that previous civilizations could never have imagined. Our ability to store vast quantities of information, to communicate across global distances, to create multiple redundant copies of essential knowledge provides unprecedented opportunities for preservation. The question is whether we'll use these tools wisely, guided by the hard-won wisdom of our predecessors. The ancient preservation strategies offer concrete guidance for this challenge. The principle of encoding knowledge in multiple formats suggests we should embed essential information not just in digital archives, but in physical monuments, cultural practices, and educational traditions. The practice of geographical distribution implies we should ensure that critical knowledge exists in multiple locations and contexts, not concentrated in single institutions or regions. Most importantly, the ancient understanding that knowledge must be actively maintained and transmitted reminds us that preservation is not a passive process. It requires conscious effort, institutional commitment, and cultural prioritization. Knowledge that is merely stored without being actively engaged and transmitted will eventually decay, no matter how sophisticated the storage medium. As we contemplate these possibilities, we must also consider what we might already be losing. In our rush toward digital modernization, how much traditional knowledge have we failed to preserve? In our focus on specialized expertise, how much integrated understanding have we allowed to fragment? In our emphasis on innovation, how much inherited wisdom have we neglected to maintain? The evidence suggests that every previous civilization has faced similar challenges, and that many have failed to meet them successfully. The knowledge they lost may have included understandings that took centuries or millennia to develop. The technologies they abandoned may have represented solutions to problems we still struggle with today. But the very fact that we can recognize these patterns, that we can decode the preservation strategies embedded in ancient myths and monuments, suggests that the cycle of forgetting and remembering continues. We are the inheritors of knowledge that has survived multiple civilizational collapses. We are the current guardians of understandings that have been preserved across vast spans of time. This inheritance comes with profound responsibility. We must not only preserve what we've received, but actively work to ensure its transmission to future generations. We must recognize that our current achievements, impressive as they may seem, are part of a much longer story of human development that includes both triumphs and catastrophic losses. The possibility that human civilization didn't begin in Sumer, that our most ancient cultures were already engaged in reconstruction rather than original creation, fundamentally changes how we understand our place in history. We are not the first to achieve sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and social organization. We may not even be the most advanced civilization to have existed on Earth. But we are the current custodians of human knowledge, the present guardians of accumulated wisdom. The evidence we've explored suggests that this role has been filled by countless generations before us, each working to preserve essential understanding through their own periods of challenge and change. The mysteries of Göbekli Tepe, the sophistication of the Indus Valley civilization, the mathematical precision of Sumerian astronomy all point toward a profound truth about human nature. We are not just builders and innovators, but preservers and transmitters. Our greatest achievements may not be our original creations, but our successful maintenance and transmission of inherited wisdom. As we drift toward rest, contemplating these vast spans of time and the civilizations that have risen and fallen within them, we might find comfort in recognizing our connection to this ancient tradition of preservation. The knowledge that guides our modern world has been shaped by countless generations of careful guardianship. The wisdom we take for granted has survived through the dedicated efforts of people who understood that nothing valuable persists without conscious effort. The cycle continues, and we are part of it. The mysteries we've explored tonight remind us that human civilization is both more fragile and more resilient than we often imagine. More fragile because even the most sophisticated cultures can lose their accumulated knowledge through neglect or catastrophe. More resilient because the essential elements of human understanding have found ways to survive across multiple cycles of collapse and renewal. In recognizing this pattern, we honor both the achievements of the past and the responsibilities of the present. We acknowledge that our current knowledge stands on foundations laid by civilizations whose very existence has been largely forgotten. We accept that our own contributions to human understanding will be meaningful only if we ensure their successful transmission to those who come after us. The evidence that could rewrite human history ultimately teaches us that history itself is not a linear progression, but a spiral, returning again and again to similar challenges and opportunities. Each cycle offers the possibility of reaching new heights of understanding, but only if we remember the lessons of the past and commit ourselves to their preservation. As we close this exploration into the forgotten chapters of human history, we carry with us not just new questions about the past, but new responsibilities for the future. The mysteries we've examined tonight remind us that we are part of a story much larger than our individual lives, a story that depends on each generation's willingness to preserve and transmit the accumulated wisdom of humanity. In the quiet moments before sleep, as we contemplate these vast possibilities, we might find ourselves connected to something timeless and essential. We are the latest chapter in humanity's ongoing effort to understand itself and its place in the cosmos. We are the current guardians of knowledge that has survived across millennia. We are the inheritors of mysteries that continue to reveal new depths of meaning with each generation that encounters them. The true unsolved mystery may not be what happened in the distant past, but what we will choose to preserve for the distant future. The evidence we've explored tonight suggests that this choice has been made countless times before by people who understood that the greatest gift they could give to posterity was the continuation of human knowledge and understanding. As we drift towards sleep tonight, consider the profound implications of this cyclical view of human civilization. If our ancestors were indeed rebuilding rather than building from scratch, it fundamentally changes how we understand human potential and achievement. The magnificent structures at Göbekli Tepe, the sophisticated urban planning of the Indus Valley, and the advanced astronomical knowledge embedded in ancient temples may not represent the dawn of civilization, but rather its phoenix-like resurrection from ashes we can barely comprehend. This perspective offers both humbling and empowering insights. It suggests that human beings have always possessed remarkable capabilities, that our ancestors were not primitive cave dwellers slowly stumbling toward enlightenment, but survivors of catastrophic losses who courageously rebuilt their world with fragments of extraordinary knowledge. The mathematical precision of the pyramids, the engineering marvels of ancient water systems, and the astronomical alignments found worldwide may be echoes of even greater achievements that time has erased. The recurring flood myths across disparate cultures take on new significance when viewed through this lens. Perhaps these stories preserve not just memories of natural disasters, but collective trauma of civilizational collapse. The careful preservation of knowledge through oral traditions, architectural monuments, and ritual practices becomes an act of defiance against forgetting, a determined effort to ensure that hard-won wisdom survives the inevitable cycles of destruction and renewal. Consider how this pattern continues today. Our digital age, for all its apparent permanence, remains surprisingly fragile. Server failures, format obsolescence, and institutional collapse could erase vast amounts of human knowledge within decades. The irony is striking. We may be more vulnerable to complete information loss than our ancestors, who carved their most important insights into stone and embedded them in stories passed down through generations. This cyclical model of civilization challenges our linear assumptions about progress. Perhaps advancement is not a steady climb toward an unknown peak, but rather a series of recoveries, each generation rediscovering and reinterpreting the wisdom of those who came before. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and modern technological breakthroughs may all follow this pattern of rediscovery rather than pure innovation. The evidence scattered across archaeological sites worldwide suggests that human civilization is far older and more sophisticated than mainstream history acknowledges. The precision of ancient stonework, the complexity of early urban planning, and the depth of astronomical knowledge point to inheritance rather than invention. Each civilization may have been a link in an unbroken chain of human achievement, carrying forward the essential knowledge needed to rebuild after catastrophe. As you close your eyes tonight, remember that you are part of this ancient continuum. The knowledge you carry, the skills you possess, and the wisdom you've gained are not just personal achievements, but contributions to humanity's collective memory. You are both inheritor and guardian of insights that may stretch back far beyond recorded history. The mystery of human civilization's true origins remains unsolved, hidden beneath layers of time and catastrophe. But perhaps the most important truth is not when we began, but how we've endured. Through countless cycles of rise and fall, human beings have demonstrated a remarkable ability to preserve what matters most, to rebuild from ruins, and to carry the light of knowledge through the darkest ages. The silence is full of answers, waiting for the right questions. The darkness is full of light, waiting for eyes that know how to see. And the past is full of futures, waiting for minds that understand that the greatest discoveries might not be ahead of us, but behind us, buried in the quiet spaces where memory and mystery meet. Sweet dreams, fellow guardians of human wisdom.